Following the end of World War I, a mutual sense of dread and guilt and disappointment fell upon the world. The world had made great achievements in the previous decades in the way of industrialization and technology. People were optimistic about a new era where technology aided men. However, all that the technology did was destroy everything and anything during the war. It goes without saying that the world took a few steps back in regards to World War I. With the signing of Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the world welcomed a new era of peace. Nations rebuilt and found new roles in the world order. This agreement comes to put an end to one of the most traumatic historical events, World War I. This conflict that lasted for 4 years is considered as a turning point in the history of any country, including the Middle East. First, let's start by describing the meanings of few important terms. The Great Depression. The Great Depression was a severe worldwide economic depression that took place during 1930s. The timing varied across nations. In most countries it started in 1929 and lasted until 1930s. It was the longest, deepest and most widespread depression in the 20th century. Between 1929 and 1932, worldwide GDP fell by an estimated 15%. Second, the Black Tuesday. The depression originated in the United States after a slow decline in lofty stock prices and became worldwide news with the stock market crash on the 29th of October, year 1929. The third term is mandates. This is the term that was meant to signify that the European countries were not establishing colonies, but instead were assisting these countries in moving towards self-government and independence. The European countries were to administer the mandates under the guidance of the newly formed League of Nations. Basically, it is an authorization granted by the League of Nations to a member nation to govern a former colony. After that, we move to the decision of the Sultan to join the Central Powers. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was shrinking. Indeed, by the time of the beginning of World War I, that took place in 1914. Britain, France, and United States and Russia were united as the Allied forces. They fought the Central Powers of Germany and Austria. At that time, the Ottoman Turks assumed the Central Powers would win the war, as Germany had won early battles in war and believed it would win this battle. Also, the Turks believed Germany would keep Russia from taking land from their declining empire, as Russia wanted Ottoman land. They also joined the Central Powers to gain needed technology from the Germans, but the Ottoman Empire weakened and collapsing through the slow loss of their territory. They were regarded as the sick man of Europe and Asia. The war did not end as the Sultan expected, as Germany lost and the Ottoman Empire is dissolved and partitioned among the Allied powers. The Holy Land is after that occupied by Britain and France. The Ottomans had three main strength points, these were the points that Europeans targeted to destroy. The first one is the control of trade. Europeans broke this strength by going around Africa and gaining control of trade. By that, the European merchants don't have to pay Ottoman fees if they go around the Middle East. And major trade routes no longer run through the Middle East, they go around Africa to avoid the Ottomans. The second Ottoman strength was their wealth. This was destroyed by the discovery of the New World leads to great wealth for Europe from the gold and silver found there. Middle East becomes very poor as European empires control world trade routes. After that comes technology, which was surpassed by the Europeans, especially in the production of guns, weapons, and other products necessary for war.
Istanbul at the beginning of the war had a huge effect on Istanbul market and dislocated government finance. As a result, it postponed debt payments and implemented special tax where Takalif al-Halba, with some requisitions. Also, there are some significant reductions in salaries for civil and military. During the war in 1914 till 1918, in comparison with Britain and France, the cost of living used to be doubled and in Germany also tripled. But in Istanbul, there were huge changes in the prices of the cost of living. For example, the price of potatoes was 1 kurs per 1 kilogram, went to 36 kurs in 1918. However, there were a lot of people who used to have fixed salaries like government officials. They became bankrupted. There was a reaction from the empire toward the food and transportation. Starting with the food, the empire used to limit the rail network, which created problems for the suppliers and also for food distribution. However, for the transportation problems resulted for inadequate railway impairment, especially after the Russian Navy bombed the coal works on the Black Sea coast and destroyed the transport ships. So they used to import coal from Germany to run the trains. As a result, the importing was insufficient factor, so the Ottomans used to turn wood as fuel starting with southern Anatolia and Syria, which resulted to another shortage in food for fruit and olive because they used to crop the trees. Moving on to the effective low-cost invasion in 1915, there were some natural disasters affected the way of living and reduced food supplies. By 1916, the wheat production has fallen by 30%, which caused shortages and suffering, especially for soldiers and civilians. As a result, the state used to establish supply agencies for the public for bread in order to control the livelihood. However, the Agriculture Obligations Law in 1916, the law made some of the urban areas to be responsible for cultivating some amounts of land. The government asserted the authority to force citizens to work on farms, facing labor shortages due to mobilization, and also the army used to use women to help in agriculture industries for the first time, in which a ministry of provisioning was created.
Economic history in Egypt in interwar period. There were major constraints on the growth of agriculture output in Egypt after World War I. Number one, rapid population growth, the deterioration of cotton yields, and external price shocks. The main argument of it is that none of these barriers was easy to surmount. Since the population pressure was irreversible, extra land was not available at low costs and cotton prices did not recover until World War II. Yet, this does not mean that Egypt's agriculture was static in interwar period. Number one, land came to be cultivated more intensely. The government invested in irrigation, drainage to get yields back to higher levels. Finally, the improvement in seeds and cultivation techniques were aimed at reversing the deflationary pressures. For the crop output, El-Imam is the best as it covers all major crops in Egypt except clover, which is bersim. The crop basket consists of cottonseed, wheat, barley, maize, millet, rice, beans, lentils, onions, sugarants, and fenugreek, which is helba. The graph here shows the total crop output, current prices, and acreage in Egypt 1913 till 1945. It shows how it has a lot of fluctuations as it increased in 1920, then it started to decrease and then increase for the total output and the area. Since 1920 till 1932 is when the decline in output started and depended towards the end of the period. What's striking is that this was the case despite some improvement in the total acreage. The main factor behind the slump was obviously the ongoing deflation in prices, particularly in the case of cotton. This table shows the crop output decomposition in 1913 till 1939 in Egypt and shows how it started to increase in 1913 till 20 and then decreased 1920 till 29 and then start to decrease more in 1929 till 32 and start to increase in 1932 till 1939. It also has a lot of fluctuations. All that being said, it's also important to note that the interwar performance of Egypt's agriculture was not as poor as it usually portrayed. For the industrial field in Egypt started to improve its production in different industrial fields like textiles, woolens, silk, food processing, tobacco, milling, sugar, and vegetable oils.
For Syria,
interwar period that took place between 1919 till 1938. Now I'm going to talk about and examine the growth of economic nationalism in Syria. Special attention will be paid to the role of Damascus in the development of national enterprises and modern industry, not because Damascus was the most important economic center in Syria, but rather because it was the center of the national independence movement. In 1930, several landowners, merchants, and national bloc chiefs headed by Faris el-Khiral founded the National Cement Company on a joint stock basis and capitalized it at 144,000 LT gold with 24,000 shares. As a building material, political and economic stability made investment in urban real estate and housing construction a safer refuge for local and capital, and the raising of tariff barriers allowed local cement to compete with imported cement. In addition to that, the cost of importing such a bulky product made cement production an immediately sensible import substitution industry. Another successful industry was food processing. In the Damascus region, the most prized agricultural products were fruits, and in particular the apricot, اللي هو المشمش. Syria ranked third in world apricot production. For generations, the bulk of the crop had been processed by primitive methods into apricot paste for export. After 1928, other modern industries began to spring up in Damascus, Halab, and other towns. And some, like the leather tanning, weaving, and soaps industries, concentrated in machinizing dyeing handicrafts and on constructing them to meet changing taste patterns and demand. Several modern factories were built during the Depression years in 1930 to 1934. Because of a decline in foreign imports and because labor costs dropped owing to the surplus labor created by the extension of many handicrafts and the limitation of immigration possibilities. By 1934, there were reportedly 63 modern factories in Damascus, 71 in Halab, and by the end of 1936, Damascus alone had 7 registered.
In conclusion, as we saw that mutual sense of dread, guilt, and disappointment fell upon the world, regardless the technological advancement that occurred in this period of time. The battle between major controllers in the world made it worse, as we mentioned before. There were many threats which were made due to the war, like the decline in trading power, wealth, and technology in the Ottoman Empire specifically, and financial declines in Istanbul occurred also. Also, other main resources of living were affected, like the distribution of food, the availability of transportation services, and the enforcement of laws on some industries, especially the agriculture. The Middle East region also got affected by the war. But what happened is that, after a short period of time, the Middle East countries gained back their powers by launching different projects to improve their economic situation, like what happened in Syria, as mentioned before. In a nutshell, the war affected most of the powerful countries around the globe, but some countries fought back to gain their power, and others failed and lost it entirely.